Welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to have you all here with us today. Thank you for joining this webinar in where we'll discuss about insights about an effective risk assessment within the supply chain. My name is Erudite, the Portfolio Marketing Manager for Continuity Resilience and Service Management. The presenter of this webinar will be Samuel MAZOYA, a graduate of Industrial Design Technology with over 15 years in the world of IT. He is an erudite instructor with very good and unmatched delivery testimonials. His area of expertise are ITIL, ISO 28000, ISO 22301, and CRM. As usual, at the end of this presentation, we have question and answer session, and we would love to hear from you. Therefore, I highly encourage you to submit any question or comment you may have during this webinar in the chat box of your control panel. Samuel will answer to all your questions accordingly at the end of this presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you will get insightful information from this webinar. Please, Samuel, you may start the presentation.
Thank you, Erika. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on insights about an effective risk assessment within the supply chain industry. As you may have known, the supply chain has different stages, a life cycle moving from manufacturing through to inventory, to warehousing, through to transport and logistics and delivery. And for all the stages of the supply chain industry, there are inherent risks, which the service provider is actually meant to look into, assess with a view to putting in place some mitigation to prevent or reduce the impact of such risk that should they occur on business operation. Now, giving an overview of risk, in time past, the risk management methodology allows you to identify risk using any form of method that you like. However, risk management in today's business requires, one, identification of your organizational assets, the threats that such assets are exposed to, and the vulnerability, the exposure, that risk could explore or could explore to, attack such organizational assets. In this presentation, we are going to tailor it to enhance practitioners' insight on how to combine assets, threats, and vulnerability in order to identify risk to which supply chain services, processes, and activities are exposed to. So we will attempt to look at that. But before we go into that, let's look at what the concept, the basic concepts of risk management. We want to first of all look at assets. An asset is anything that has value to the organization, which needs to be protected. Now, an asset for an organization are in form of resources and capabilities. These are the things that gives the organization confidence for action. Assets in form of the people, the processes, the information, the technology, even your third-party partners. They are all assets to an organizational capability to delivering to their customers. For supply chain operations, we can categorize assets as into two categories, namely the primary assets, which consist of, like we said, the business processes, the information assets. Now, when you are conducting a risk assessment activity, these are the ones, the primary assets are the ones that you give the utmost importance. They are the ones that you endeavor to safeguard from, disruption or protect from any inherent risk. Now, you also have the supporting assets. These are the ones that support or that enables the primary assets to deliver to the business operation. These include the hardware, the software, computer networks, the sites and organizational structures needed to support the primary assets. The primary assets are to a large extent dependent on the output from the supporting assets that we have just mentioned. Now, what is a risk? A risk is the chance of something happening. It is an uncertainty. They are measured in terms of its probability and the consequence, the after effect, should such risk occur. The consequence may be either positive or negative. Risk in general sense can be defined as a threat of an action or an inaction that will prevent an organization's ability to achieve its business objective. If you fail to take an opportunity, it could offer a risk for such business organization. The result of a risk occurring are defined as the impacts. That is the after effect of such risk occurring. Now, vulnerability is another concept in risk management. It is the exposure of your assets to perceived risk, which the threat could exploit, to manifest. It's a weakness that could be exploited by a threat, for example, an open firewall port. Also, if you have a system that has an outdated antivirus, for example, it provides a vulnerability. It's an exposure for data loss, for the risk of data loss and what have you, or a password that is hardly ever changed. A missing or weak control measures can also be considered to be a vulnerability. For example, if you have an access control door where to an unauthorized environment or location within the business organization, and you do not have an access control that allows only one person at a time to access such unauthorized environment. The risk there is that somebody who is authorized to have access to it, maybe by an ID or thumbprint or whatever, if he opens the door, because you have a control that does not stipulate that only one person is allowed to have access to the place at a time, the tendency or the risk is that that one person could allow so many other people, unauthorized people, to access that doorway. That will offer a risk for the business organization. Startup approach. How do you start it? One, you need to gain the agreement on risk assessment tolerance with all stakeholders. The risk acceptance criteria for a stakeholder A may not be the same risk acceptance criteria for stakeholder B. So you need to be discuss with them. You need to gain their understanding, gain their agreement on their own tolerance level within their own business areas. Risk identification is the first step of risk assessment process, and care plus quality time should be invested in carrying out this activity, because if you do not identify the right risk that your organizational assets are exposed to, the tendency is for you to begin to develop a risk treatment that is not commensurate with your organizational operations. After identifying the risk supply chain processes, services, and activities and systems are exposed or vulnerable to, the risk evaluation process, that is assessing the impact and the likelihood of such risk occurring, will now follow. For example, if you have an inventory store that is four-walled with fiber or four-walled with wood, such inventory store has a high probability of the risk of fire incident occurring than an inventory store that is forward with bricks. To continue our startup approach, you need to also evaluate and classify the risk impacts and exposure, or vulnerabilities related to supply chain processes, activities, and operations, as well as their dependencies. If you focus majorly or only on your own organizational processes and activities and operations alone, it is a risk on its own. Because don't forget that your operation is dependent on your third-party suppliers or vendors' activities, which come along with their own associated risk as well. So you need to also look at such dependencies and evaluate and classify the risk impacts. You need to also conduct an analysis of the control in place, identify business resiliency strategy for mitigating identified risks. Now you have identified your risk, you need to look at the controls in place to determine their sufficiency to mitigate such risks. And where they are not sufficient, you would now implement some kind of corrective or improvement actions. You also need to document and present the risk assessment for management approval. Now, this is where the bulk of the job lies, because you need to be able to develop a business case that would convince management for funding, of your risk mitigation plan. Now, to make your risk assessment easier, you can use a sheet with, a table like you have on your screen here, with assets, a column for assets, a column for threats and vulnerability, and then you should also include some other columns like the risk IDs, the risk owners, the impacts should, in the event of occurrence of such risk, and the likelihood of such risk occurring. So you need to include all that in the columns. Now, developing your threats, assets, and vulnerability matrix, it is usually easier to start listing items column by column. You should avoid listing your items in rows. List them column by column. This means you should list all of your assets first, and only then, after you have listed all your assets, that you can start finding a couple of threats for each asset, in the row form. We will see it shortly. And finally, find a couple of vulnerabilities for each of the identified threats. We have identified the risk faced. Let's look at what the matching of these three, the assets, the threats, and the vulnerability, looks like in a supply chain business operation. Developing threats, assets, and vulnerability matrix. Developing threats, assets, and their vulnerability matrix. This matrix gives a broader picture of which risks have the highest probability of having the most impacts, depending on your assets, depending on the criticality of such assets, depending on the controls that you have put in place to mitigate such risk, or identify the risk. You can now begin to understand the probability of such risk occurring, and should they occur, what impact will it have on business operation. The last column should indicate your recommendation to mitigate such risk or reduce the impacts or the effect of such risk in the event of occurrence. Now, in the next slides, we are going to look at example of threats, risk, and risk matrix. Sorry. All right, that's it. Now the risk on this chart here is they are all highlighted on the rows, the first row in the chart, while you have the threats on the first column. For example, you have risk like power failure, building unauthorized access to building, and facility equipment damage, fire, and communication assets cut off, computer shut down, and so far and so on. And for every one of them, for every one of the risks, this chart, depending on your organization, you can now begin to look at, okay, what are the threats that this risk will explore to manifest. You have tornado, fire, lighting, plane crash, water leak, water or pipe leak, fire and cable cuts. So you could develop your own risk, threat, and risk matrix based on your own organizational operation in this manner. You could also cascade it down by location. For example, for organizations that have multiple locations, you could begin to cascade, develop your threat and risk matrix by location. For example, like you have here, you have in the headquarters office, the threats are identified, and the probability here is the threat identified is hurricane, and then the probability is low. And then the recommended control action that you should take or develop is a business continuity plan. For Boston office, you have power outage, which is the probability of it occurring is high, and then what is recommended here, control action, is a backup generator, UPS on critical system, and so far and so on. Then you have the one for San Francisco, Miami, and the UK office. You could now begin to look at what risk, what threats the risk in every location could exploit, and also determine the probability of such threat occurring based on the controls that you have put in place. Matching of assets, threats, and vulnerability. For example, in supply chain assets like paper documents, files, and all the rest of that, the kind of threats that such documents are exposed to or vulnerable to, fire, fire incidents, and then the exposure to it could be when the documents are not properly stored in fireproof cabinets. This could be exploited. There are vulnerability that the threat could exploit to cause the risk of fire incidents. Risk related to the loss of availability of information. Also, another threat, fire, are the vulnerability that could be exploited when there is no backup of documents, and then you have fire incident occurring and the documents are completely burnt. At the end of the day, the risk there is that you have a potential loss of availability of information, which is a critical asset within the business organization. Another threat is unauthorized access, the vulnerability, the exposure of your assets to such threats will include when the document is not locked in the cabinet, and then the risk is potential loss of confidentiality. Anybody can access the document, they could alter it, they could and cause some malicious damage to the organizational reputation. We are still matching assets, threats, and vulnerability. For the supply chain assets like digital documents, electronic documents, the threats that such documents are exposed to will include disk failure, and what are the exposure, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the vulnerabilities that such threat could exploit to manifest when there is no backup of the documents, and then the risk is potential loss of availability. Another threat is virus. When you have an outdated antivirus, when the antivirus program is not properly updated, you have an outdated one. Now the risk is potential loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Somebody would access such documents, could modify it, could an unauthorized person could tamper with it, and it loses its integrity. Another threat is unauthorized assets, and the vulnerability is when the access control scheme is not properly defined, like the door, the access control door, that example that I gave. And what the risk you will be exposed to in this case will be a potential loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Another one, unauthorized assets, vulnerability. The assets, when you give access to too many people, you know, the risk is potential loss of confidentiality. So these are, you know, identifying and matching up your assets together with the associated threats, as well as the exposure, you know, of such assets to such threats that such threats could explore to manifest. Another one is system administrator. The threats faced by this is unavailability of this person. Maybe he's sick. Now the vulnerability, there is no replacement for this position, you know, and then the risk is potential loss of availability. So you need to identify all these and understand how to, you know, mitigate them to prevent or mitigate the impact of such risk should they occur. Another threat is frequent error, you know, vulnerability, lack of training. You know, when somebody is not trained, it's not aware, it doesn't have the prerequisite knowledge or skill to carry out that particular task and activity, the risk that you will be exposed to will be potential loss of integrity and availability. Now, how much is enough? How much threats, how much risk can we identify? Very often you hear people ask how many risks should be identified. If they start being really thorough, for each asset, they could find 10 threats that such assets are vulnerable to. And for each threat, at least 5 vulnerabilities could, you know, be identified realistically. Now, if you are a small organization with 50 assets, this will mean you will end up with 2,500 risks, you know, in view of what we have said above, which will probably overkill for the size of a small company. This is why you should focus only on the most important threats and vulnerability. While including all assets, that would mean that for each asset, you should identify an average of 5 threats. And for each threat, an average of 2 exposures of vulnerability that could be exploited by such threats. This way, you will end up with 500 risk for a smaller company with 50 assets, which is quite manageable. Thank you very much. Hello?
Thank you, Samuel, for this excellent presentation. Before we proceed with question and answer session, I would like to inform all the attendees that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 28000 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. This training is designed to simplify trade and expedite the transport of goods across borders and ensure you the product safety by reducing risk with ISO 28000 certification. A PCB certificate will demonstrate your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. For more information, please visit our website pcb.com/training. We will now go with the questions. The first question is, when a risk assessment is completed, what is the most important part of analysis for determining objectives that meet policy and strategic requirements?
Please, could you come again?
Yes. When a risk assessment is completed, what is the most important part of the analysis for determining objectives that meet policy and strategic requirements.
Now, thank you very much. The most important part, as you may be aware, are human beings. The people are the most critical assets of the service provider organization, and it is important that they take the utmost importance or the utmost priority in protecting, because it is the most critical assets that will help or geared towards the achievement of the business objective. So the people are the most critical assets that should be, first of all, taken care of.
Thank you for this answer. The next question, one attendee wrote, what are the key attributes of supply chain management?
Well, the key attributes of supply chain management. Supply chain, like you know, is majorly geared towards logistics. The key attribute would be talking about things that are within the supply chain. I started this presentation by mentioning the various stages of the supply chain. You want to talk about information management. You want to talk about transborder activities and things like that. So you want to look at all the various supply chain activities and pick out the major attributes within these activities. Majorly, like, let me repeat it, you talk about the manufacturing, from manufacturing to inventory, from inventory to warehousing, from warehousing to transport and logistics, and finally to delivery. So these are the major attributes.
Thank you, Samuel, for this interesting answer. Yeah. Because of the time limitation, we will go with the last question. Yeah. Can you please explain the difference between supply chain and supply chain management?
Supply chain itself is the operation, while the management is the management of activities within the life cycle of the supply chain operation.
Once again, thank you, Samuel, for this excellent and informative presentation. And I want to thank all the attendees as well who have joined us today. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. Please be informed that this webinar is recorded and we will upload in our official YouTube channel and in our website, pacb.com. Also, we will upload the slides in our SlideShare account in where you can view the slides as well. Goodbye, everyone, and I wish you all a good day.
Thank you.